Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Misha Kligman. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Fine Art, Photo and Film here in the college, and I teach painting and drawing. I'm excited to introduce Jason Needham today to you. Jason is a Kansas City-based artist, most known for his lush landscape paintings. Jason's work has been exhibited widely, most recently at such venues as the Habitat Contemporary, the Kansas City Artists Coalition, and the Bunker Center for the Arts. Jason's work is in numerous private collections, as well as in the collections of the Truman Medical Center and the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art. You can see Jason's painting down in the Kansas Gallery right now, so take a look on the way out if you haven't yet seen it. In 2019, Jason was awarded a very prestigious Paula Krasner Artist Grant for his work, and not very many artists in Kansas City that I know have one of these, so it's a very select, very prestigious group of artists. Please help me welcome Jason Needham.
Thank you, Misha. Very happy to be here today. Also, happy to get out of the mask. It's I think I'm out of practice. I must be spending too much time at home. Thrilled to be here. I was an art student at KU from 1989 to 1994. And I can still remember at that time in my junior year when somebody rolled along and said, hey, you know, have you seen the Elizabeth Murray show at the community college? And I'm kind of like, no, Elizabeth Murray Community College. Or a year after that when somebody mentioned, oh, you know, did you know there was a Jean-Michel Basquiat show at the community college? And I'm going, community college, Basquiat. It was kind of a, interesting disconnect. I wasn't quite sure what to think, but needless to say, we were making regular trips here to the old Gallery of Art that was in the Carlson Center. So, the community college is a big part of my education, and of course now the Gallery of Art has become the Nerman, which is a big part of my continuing education as an artist. So appreciate being here for sure. As you can see, Instagram is kind of the best way to follow my art endeavors. So if you're out there and want to check in with that, you can check in with me on Instagram. I'm going to start back about 10 or 12 years. In 2013, 2014, I was a full-time stay-at-home parent. I was kind of looking for ways to reinvigorate my studio practice. Things were just kind of stale. None of my old tricks were working. I was, looking around and trying lots of different methods and looking for different inspirations, and became aware of Wilbur Niewald, who some folks probably know has been plein air painting around Kansas City for over 50 years. He's in his 90s now, but he's still out and about doing some, as I understand it. There was a few other groups like urban sketching style groups and plein air painting groups that were getting some press at that time. And even though I'd been a working artist for a long time, I really never had gone out and, taken an easel out into the environment and tried to do that. And so in looking for these new inspirations and trying to come up with some things to get excited about, that became kind of an interesting project. I thought, well, let's go do this. Let's, get out of the house, take the easel, and see what happens. I was very nervous about doing this, and so to get over my kind of initial fear, I would go and I would join up with these plein air festivals. So there were other plein air artists out there. It made me less nervous to be painting along with other people. This is a picture from Leawood City Park during one of those early plein air festivals. I had made a few paintings outside at this time, but this was pretty early on. You can see the scene I was kind of painting in the upper left-hand corner there. But there was bike paths and parking lots and people all around me, but I still was drawn to these much more secluded, overgrown kind of areas. Here's a close-up of the finished painting. I think I spent about 2.5 or 3 hours on it. The Nerman did acquire this painting for their collection. It was the first painting that I, had gotten into a museum collection, and from the show that this was exhibited in was actually the only painting that sold. Through these festivals, I did end up tackling a few urban scenes. This was a view in Penn Valley Park looking out over the Boulevard Beer Hall into the West Bottoms. A similar view of the West Bottoms also from Penn Valley Park. But I quickly was drawn much more into these lush forested scenes. I grew up in rural Kansas, so there was a little bit of an attraction there. I still was, a parent with a young child, and so childcare was an issue, and my folks live out in the country outside of Lawrence, so I would, drive back, and they would watch my daughter, and I would go out into the woods behind their house and paint. There was always kind of a fun disconnect for me where I felt like I was in the jungle or painting these exotic scenes, but the truth of the matter was there was a car or a parking lot or a highway or, a cooler with food and air conditioning, usually close at hand. So the paintings seemed like some wild adventure, but in reality, I was usually pretty close to home. At the time, this was the largest plein air painting I'd attempted. 24 inches tall is the highest the easel will hold. And I'm not a speed painter by any means. There are some of these plein air painters that can really whip out the paintings. I'm definitely not that person, but this particular painting I did finish in just one 6-hour session. Usually, however, it takes me 2 or 3 or even 4 hours to paint a small painting. This obviously is only 8 by 8 inches, very simple. And so it's much more of the normal kind of thing to work on a very small scale and be achievable. This did have the effect of really getting me excited over time. It really did invigorate the whole kind of artistic practice for me. And I began able to move back kind of into the studio. And of course, by this time, I'd accumulated a tremendous amount of plein air reference, photography, et cetera, to utilize. And I started working on some larger scale pieces. All of the same areas. In some ways, some of these areas, as the crow flies, is not very far from even where I grew up. Areas around where my folks live, or areas in Kansas City near my house. Where I would, visit and take photographs or paint and then go home and try to make the larger scale paintings. Obviously influenced by Impressionism, some of those things, but really it was the whole adventure of just getting out of the house. There was so many things to deal with. It was always more physically grueling to be outside painting than I ever imagined, which ended up, I was much more impressed with even Wilbur, because I know he's been out doing it for years, and it can really be quite taxing, as anybody knows who spends some time outside. So getting the gear out there, getting the gear home, the whole thing just seemed like a kind of a nonstop adventure for me. Some of the paintings would, as I mentioned, I'm not a speed painter, so rarely could I finish any of these in one setting. By this time, I've started to maybe start the painting out in the woods, take some photographic reference, and then take it back into the studio to complete. And some of what you're seeing here did build up. I was able to win a Pollock Krasner grant, which funded me through 2019. I applied actually all the way kind of the end of 2017, beginning of 2018. It took an entire year to get back the news, but it was really quite a... This painting, Later the Same Sun, is actually based in Roanoke Park, which is not too far from, I live on the Kansas City, Kansas side, but very close to the state line. This large-scale painting, as I mentioned, as time went on, the scale of the paintings was able to increase. I was, really back in the studio working quite a bit, so this is 5 by 8 feet. This actually isn't a real scene. It doesn't really exist. I had multiple photographs that were of similar lighting and similar views, and so I kind of actually in the studio just collaged. They were randomly laying on a table, and I realized they made a complete scene. So I collaged the print-offs together and created this kind of artificial scene, which, I was able to use the photo reference to base this on. Some of these views are kind of greatly exaggerated. This painting's 64 inches tall. I mean, this actual place I was at was, the view I'm looking at is maybe 24 inches tall or 30 inches off the ground. And I began to take multiple photographs from different perspectives, and I'd print off several of them. And so this was a painting that was really created from multiple different views, multiple different reference photographs. And every day I'd come back into the studio and I would pick a different photograph, different lighting conditions, different, and I never liked just working from a single reference photo. It always kind of was just too limiting or too boring. And so one of the ways to make it, being outside, of course, is very visually exciting. And one of the ways to make the studio a little more interesting was to do this technique where, say, I would have multiple views of different lighting of a scene, and on different days I would use the different imagery. Under Tough Old Stars, which is a painting in the Truman Medical Center collection, most of the work the plein air work is finished in a session or two. The larger scale studio paintings, maybe I finish in a week or a week and a half. And it tends to be just I start it, I come forward, I finish it. I maybe only work on one or maybe two paintings at a time. This is the rare occasion, though, where this painting really hung around in the studio for about a year. And so it ended up accumulating kind of different types of mark making, a lot of different types of information, easier to see in person than on this slide. But it was kind of an interesting piece for me just because it had so much kind of accumulated history built up over kind of a long period of time. It might have even been over a year that I worked on and off on this piece. The areas that I like to be in, as mentioned, are kind of these more jungly tropical things. In the summer, they're almost completely shrouded. I loved that kind of sensation where the little pinholes of light would traverse around me. So little weeds would get their little moment in the spotlight. Another larger painting that is also in the collection of the Truman Medical Center. I haven't been able to go see these in their new home because of COVID, but looking forward to checking out how these are installed at some point in time. The painting that's included in the Norman collection, but it's in the Real Unreal exhibition, is called Entanglement. I always think it's instructive to see some things that are in progress. So I'll show a sequence of photographs of this entanglement in the studio. I really, even though I had the photo reference, I had some sketches and drawings, I still tried to throw a lot of random chance and, different things that I have to fight against into the process. And so in this instance, without really much regard to what the final image was, I just coated the whole surface with just kind of this multicolored array of acrylic washes. I should mention that all the paintings are acrylic on canvas. A little bit tough to work with outdoors, but over time I just got used to it. And oil painting, of course, can be difficult if you're living in apartments and small spaces. And so over the years, I just switched to acrylic and have never gone back. So here I'm starting to lay in some of the darks. I mean, once the kind of background was built up with the multicolors, then I'm really starting to zero in on the structure. I threw my darks in first and then started kind of just working on some of the details. Here's a studio shot. Over in the corner on the bulletin board, you can see the print-offs and some of the photo references there that I would have. But really the photo reference at a certain point, it's just there as a loose guide. I never want the paintings to look like photographs necessarily. There's all kinds of information in there that I can, pick from and choose from, but in the end, I mean, these are definitely paintings, and nobody would mistake these for, there's the finished piece, which was quite colorful and it was just one happy accident from the beginning all the way through to the end, and painted this in about 4 days. Finished it right before the exhibition, put it up, and most of the time when I finish a painting, it stays around for a while. You live with it, you get to know it, and this sucker went out the door and never came back, and it's here at home at the Nerman now. So that was really at the end of 2019. In early 2020, I had started a number of landscapes and been working on them. I'm going to show just a couple of those here now because I actually, from the beginning of 2020 until just recently, I wasn't able to work on them. So this painting was, basically not in progress over a year, but sat unworked on for a year. Every so often I do something that's not the Lush. This is a very similar place as to where I would normally paint, but it's obviously kind of a very early spring before things have grown. So I have a few of these winter scenes, a few of these kind of other seasonal scenes out there. Here's an in-progress painting, either possibly titled The Entrance to Avondale or The Ditch Witch. So again, these were pre-COVID. And when COVID hit, I, just like everybody, the big interruption, I was, didn't work in the studio at all for several months. And when my wife was there at a certain point and working from home, and so we could help with the Zoom lessons. And for some reason, when I got back into the studio, I was unable to even start up on any of that other work. And these snowscape images, which were reminiscent of a very particular snowstorm in January of 19. And, I'm experienced enough to know when you just got to go with the flow. And so I didn't really resist these, even though it was kind of a complete departure from my previous work. And for about 6 weeks, I went from 0 to, 100 miles an hour and painted 5 or 6 paintings in about 6 weeks, all kind of on this snowscape theme. It was sort of an apocalyptic, mythic ice age but also there's a lot of humor in these to me, a lot of playfulness, and of course the process of making them was completely different. The color palette was completely different. So all those things were very refreshing. And, to go from not working at all to then suddenly being back in the studio and being very focused, it was a tremendous, refreshing thing. Of course, came screeching to a halt after about 4 or 5 weeks. And then again, I was in a long period of time where I was unable to do much work. Sometimes not because I didn't have the time, but sometimes I just didn't have the will over COVID and some of these things to do it. An opportunity came up, though, to show, there's another small scale one that I really like, Drift. An opportunity came up to show these work because they'd never left the studio. Obviously, this was all during the stay-at-home orders. I'd kind of virtually done a Facebook Live tour through the Artist Coalition, but so I was excited to. And so in the fall, was able to get back into the studio with about 4 or 5 weeks preparation and kind of was able to knock out some much larger scale versions of these paintings. To me, one of the things about these is while I was working on them is sometimes they appear to be this big kind of mega storm or Arctic extravaganza, but I also thought of these as maybe just almost like a microscopic view of an ice crystal, or these could be structures and energy particles or forces of nature that aren't even visible to the human eye, and kind of revealing some hidden structure of the universe. This last one was kind of one of the more exaggerated, animated versions of this, where the snowflakes and things practically have lightning and faces and hidden in there. And so on one level that I thought of it as this kind of mythic apocalyptic flood, I always saw these with a great deal of humor and kind of ridiculousness. And for this painting in particular, I always imagined that the Abominable Snowman and Yukon Jack from the old Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer stop motion animation cartoon, they were kind of just off stage in this painting, waiting for their moment to come in, battling the snowstorm. Just to touch briefly on some of the kind of process that I have. Drawing has always been really huge. I'm a big believer in sketchbooks. That means everything from doing preparatory sketches to warm up when I first get into the studio, working through ideas, but also the sketchbook and drawing just as a lifeline, because of course there were periods of time where I didn't maintain a studio, didn't have the ability to paint and those kind of things. And so drawings and the sketchbook is really what kind of carried me, through various periods of time after leaving college. And certainly even over these last 10 years and 5 years, I've had periods where drawing was kind of the string I was able to hold on to while I made some kind of a transition to get back to doing some larger work. This can be everything from working through ideas like the Snowscape show, which you kind of see in some of those, to even just the out the window. It doesn't have to be anything dramatic. You know, maybe I only have 45 minutes or 50 minutes, but how can I make that doable? So it can get lost in some house plants around the place, or look out the window. Here's just a couple quick sketches that from observation just around the house. I've always liked drawing electrical cords for some reason, maybe kind of like the vines. Well, thank you. I will wrap it up. I think there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions, and really appreciate Misha's introduction, and thanks again to the Nerman for having me. I love being here. So look forward to hearing if you guys have anything to ask.